Welcome to this webinar. Today's webinar is about imposition or ganging or nesting or whatever your preferred term is for putting stuff on a larger sheet. And more specifically, it is about Imp, which can fulfill all three of these things. And the way we're going to do this is we'll have a little bit of an introduction here in the form of a presentation, and then afterwards, and probably the biggest part of this webinar, I am going to show you the technology itself and some of the functionality in Imp. This will not be a complete demo of the product. There is way too much functionality in Imp to show everything in the half an hour, 3/4 of an hour planned for this webinar, but I will try to show you how the application works, what the principles are, and give you an idea of what this does so that you can see whether this would work in your workflow and see what questions you have. Let's get started here, and let's get started with a little bit of an introduction into what Imp is. Imp is automated layout planning software, and very specifically I am not saying that it is imposition software because it can actually go a little bit further than that, and it can be used both in the prepress side of a business to create imposed PDFs or output a die line of a complete plate, but it can also be used in the planning stages. When someone receives a job and wants to figure out how much that job would cost in the end, then Imp can also be used to estimate what kind of imposition would be possible and what the final cost would be, both for the printing and finishing parts of that particular job. What kind of jobs? Well, that's one of the big advantages in Imp, and something I think that will come back later as well. You can handle any kind of job in this application. So if you are doing bound work like books or magazines, then Imp can create signatures and do the planning of final sheets with those signatures. If you're doing business cards or folders that are rectangular, then Imp can do ganging of those jobs. And it can also handle irregularly shaped jobs, so jobs that have a die cut in it. And it goes as far as to support label workflows, packaging workflows, and all the features that are necessary for those particular workflows. And it does all of these things in a manual fashion, and that is what Imp, the application Imp, does. But there is also a possibility to work semi-automatic by defining jobs that need to be put in imposition in CSV files or XML files that are opened in the application, or by using Imp Flow, which is a separate application that uses hot folders, and by simply dropping PDF documents or again CSV or XML in a folder of Imp Flow, all the calculations will be handled automatically, and output of the final imposed sheet will be handled automatically. And Imp Flow supports XML as an input format, which means that it is very easy to link it into another application or into a larger workflow. Making a link with an order tracking system or with an MIS system, integrating it into applications such as FileTrain or Switch for workflow automation. All of these things are possible. So why is Imp special? There are a number of players in this market, of course, and what is it that makes Imp stand out from these other applications? Well, first of all, what we already talked about a little bit is that there is no separation of jobs, meaning that Imp, first of all, supports all kinds of different jobs, but secondly, it can gang these different types of jobs together, which means For example, if you have um, a bound job that has a cover that is to be printed on a particular material, and you also have other flyers or cards that need to be printed on the same material, then those two can be combined on the same sheet, which means that Imp can optimize your workflow, the work that needs to be printed, much better than applications that would only handle bound products. And the same goes for rectangular and die cut jobs. If I'm working with business cards or labels, for example, and some of these are rectangular, others have a die cut in them, then both of these types of jobs can be ganged together and nested together on the same sheet. The second point is a very important one. Imp is a layout calculation software, and a very advanced one at that. What that means is that the calculations, the optimization that it does to figure out how particular jobs will fit the best on what sheet and on which device they would best be printed, that calculation, which can be very complex, is something that Imp excels at. It will give you the best possible result across a number of different machines that you might want to use for printing that job. And by calculating probably thousands of different potential combinations in doing so. And it does that very, very quickly, so that it's not really a problem to try different alternatives on your end as well. And I will show that a little bit during the demo afterwards. Third point is that it is possible to create both the imposed job, so the final print sheet, and cutting information, which means, for example, a PDF file or a CF2 file or a DXF file that contains the cut lines and the crease lines and everything else that you need from a job. It is possible to create these pieces in one go. You don't need separate applications, you don't need post-processing. Imp is capable of giving you an imposed print sheet and giving you all the die cut information. It is also capable of doing imposition on sheets and rolls, and you can define both in the application, and again, Imp will be able to tell you what the most economical option is based on the parameters and the jobs that you give it. And while we're talking mostly about sheet optimization and calculation of different options and so on, and that is definitely where Imp it gives you a significant advantage, Imp can also do the opposite. It can take an existing layout, for example, because you already have a particular die made and you want to specifically use that particular die, it can use an existing layout and do the imposition in that layout, which might make sense in many cases. You might want different flavors of the same job, one in red, one in green, one in yellow, one in blue, each to be printed with different quantities. And what you want Imp to do in that case is calculate how many ups of each of these different flavors need to be on a sheet in order, again, to have the most economical print afterwards. And Imp can do that just as easily as it would do all the calculations itself. And it can do completely hands-off ganging and nesting, and that's what we talked about when we talked about Imp Flow. You have this application that can be fed or driven by XML that is put into an input folder. Imp Flow can pick up that XML and execute all the instructions that are in that XML, and then it will generate automatically all the output. And that output can include a new XML file that contains all the details about the planning that it has done, all the calculation details, how many ups, how many sheets on which printing press, on which size of sheet that is going to be done, all of these details in there. But the output can also include a project file that can easily be opened in the manual version of Imp afterwards. So you could have all of these calculations done automatically and at the end receive a file that you can easily open in Imp to manually verify the imposition layout before you send it to production. All of these different things are possible. So how does it work? And I will not spend too much time here because I want to show you these things in the imposition application itself, of course, but in very briefly, the first step is always making sure you have a correct configuration. And in that configuration is where you define all the available media that you have, where you define the presses or printers that you have, and where you set up your finishing equipment. And for all of these categories, you will typically define technical parameters and costing parameters. Once you've done that, you can specify what the jobs are that you want to put in imposition, that you want to gang together or nest together. And Imp calls these things components. You will see that in a second as well. You can define these either with or without a PDF file, which means, that's an important point, means that I can start an imposition calculation or a ganging calculation if I only have the dimensions of the jobs that I want to impose, or for a book, if I have the dimensions and the number of pages in the book, for example. Once the calculation has been done and I have finally received the PDF files for the book or the business cards or the other jobs, then I can easily merge that PDF into the calculated sheets that are already there. So all the work can be done with or without the graphics files already available. Components can also be created from a comma-separated file, which makes it easier to load a large number of jobs in a very quick way. They can be loaded from an XML file, same principle, and of course this XML approach makes it very easy for integration purposes, as we already said before. And then there is a planning step, and in that planning step you get to choose which of those files you want to impose together. You also get to decide which presses that you have defined in the configuration you want to consider for this particular ganging, what the ganging method is, whether it should be rectangular, in a grid, fixed number of columns and rows, nesting for things that use die cuts. And then you can ask Imp to do the complete imposition for you without interfering, or plan one layout at a time and show you what options you have. Now, this all sounds relatively theoretical, if I dare say. So let's see if we can figure out how that works in the application itself. I've switched to my Windows environment here, and what you can see running here already are the two applications that we are going to talk about. In the background you have Imp, the manual application to do this imposition, ganging or nesting, and in the foreground we have Imp Flow, which is the fully automated hands-off workflow or hot folder based version of the application. And what you'll see is that in both applications you can do substantially the same thing. So the technology is the same in Imp and in Imp Flow. It is just that Imp Flow can do these things in a hands-off way using hot folders, where in Imp you need to sit there, click on different things and make things happen manually. So let's start with Imp, and I have this open on the main screen, empty screen. On your left you can already see a number of ways to create or start jobs, but instead of going here directly, what I'm going to do first is go into Tools and open the configuration area. as I said in my presentation, this configuration part is very important because this is where you define which materials you want to do the imposition on, what presses you have, or output devices as a more generic term, as we also support large format print, for example, and then a range of finishing equipment that you can define as well. Now, how do you define these? Well, for materials, I could either define a new material in a completely manual way, or I can import them from a CSV file. And this would allow me to make an automatic link with an MIS system, for example. The MIS prints out a CSV file once every so much time that contains the current state of which media you have in stock and available, and then that can be automatically read by Imp, and Imp will then fill the list of materials. As you can see, that list is grouped by type of material. So I could go to coated paper, and then I have the different weights under there. And for each weight, I can define which sheet sizes I have available and which roll widths I have available as well. What I said in the introduction is that for all the things in the configuration, you get to define technical parameters and costing parameters. The technical parameters you can see, that includes, for example, the sheet sizes or roll sizes, but also, for example, the width of the thickness, if you want, it's a better term, thickness of the medium that we're defining here. And another important one for bound jobs would be what is the allowed fold depth. So when Imp is calculating signatures, how many times can a particular sheet be folded before we reach the limits of that particular paper. The costing parameter for media is relatively simple. I get to define either by weight or by surface area how much that particular medium costs. What you'll see later is that the technical parameters, of course, are used to determine where this medium can be printed, on which presses that I have defined can I use that particular material. The costing parameters are used to calculate what the total cost is going to be of the print job that we put in ganging. So this is the material side, and if I open the press side, you'll see that I have a demo setup. So I'm very rich. I have lots of output devices here. All of these output devices are separated into categories, and we go from offset with sheet fed and web fed presses, the same for digital technology, again sheet fed or web fed, and then a separate category for large format, including flatbed and roll-to-roll printing, and a flexo for things that are in the packaging market, for example. Each of these different categories of output devices determine what type of parameters you can specify. So if I select a sheet-fed press, you'll see that again I have lots of technical parameters that I get to define, and I want to draw your attention to one that is stock thickness, which defines the minimum and the maximum thickness of the stock that is acceptable for this particular device. Each of these has that set up. This minimum and maximum stock thickness, in combination with the thickness of the material that you define, is going to determine which possibilities we have. If a job uses a 130 GSM coated paper, Imp will look at the thickness defined in the materials database, and if you then ask to have this printed on a particular press, then it will also check that that press is actually capable of printing on that particular material. Yeah? Imp will never allow you to make a combination that would not actually be possible because of the technical parameters of the output devices or the media. So I have the basic parameters for this sheet fed press. I also have margins. I have a possibility to define where this particular press would not be able to print on a sheet. For example, if you have a press that has guidance rails for the paper in the middle, in the center of the sheet as it passes through the press, then I can define in the middle of the sheet a certain thickness or a strip of a certain width where that particular machine will not be able to print. Any imposition that we calculate will stay away not only from the margin areas that need to be free, but also from these non-printing strip areas that you define here. That press also allows me to specify costing. And as you can see, there is a wide range of parameters that allow you to specify in great detail how much a particular press is going to cost to run a particular job on it. And this is important because the more accurate you are going to fill out this costing information, the more accurate you're going to set up this information in Imp, of course, the more accurate Imp will be able to do calculations and calculate what the final print cost is going to be. Because Imp will let you compare different presses, and you can specify, and I will do that in a demo in a few seconds, you can specify 2 or 4 or 6 or whatever number of different presses that you're considering. And because Imp will calculate solutions on all of these presses, it is important that this is filled out in a way that it reflects the actual cost of running a particular press, because that's the only way that Imp would be able to compare two different offset presses against each other, for example, or even better, that it would be able to compare a particular offset press with a particular digital press. Now, the parameters that you have, like I said, depend on the type of press that we define. And you can already see that for the basic parameters, we have different setup here than we had for a sheet fed press, but you can also see that in the costing, where this reflects a click cost for digital devices, where on the offset side we had all of the parameters to define the running cost of that particular press, not based on click. The same goes for large formats, where the costing is different, where the technical parameters are going to be different as well. But even more importantly, between the offset or digital side and the large format side, there is also going to be differences in terms of the algorithm that Imp is going to use. Because when you're dealing with imposition or ganging or nesting in a large format workflow, you typically have other expectations than what you have in an offset workflow or in a pure digital workflow. In large format, for example, Imp is going to take care to print exactly the number of copies that you have requested, where if you look at something on the sheet-fed offset side, the fact that you're going to print an additional 100 or 200 business cards is not a big concern if Imp determines that doing so gives you a better ganging and one that is going to be economically better when you look at all the jobs in that ganging. So the technology, the algorithms that are used can also be different depending on the different output devices I have here. I could go into a lot more detail of this, but I'm not going to do so because I want to keep this relatively short. Of course, it's obvious that if you have questions, we could go into more detail in a future session about any of this. So we've looked at the configuration part. Let's actually make Imp work for a change. And while I could define individual products, and actually I could do that by simply creating an empty product where I can define which the bound components are, books, covers, flyers, that need to be bound in a specific way, anything that has a folding scheme, really, unbound components, and where then at the bottom I can calculate plans. So I could do this all from scratch, but for this demo, what I'm going to do is I'm going to load a comma separated file, and Imp has multiple versions of that file. Depends a little bit on what workflow you're in, what type of information you want to pass along. I'm going to use type 1, and I'm going to load that. I'm going to ask Imp to look at the files that I have and infer, so detect all the colors that are used in those files. I can ask for some bleed, so let's ask for 2 millimeters of bleed. And if these files contain die lines, I also can specify what the name of the spot color is that is going to be used for the cut line, crease line, perforation line, and so on. If I don't know exactly, and or in a particular workflow I could have multiple names, then I can specify those in a comma separated list. So let me specify this. I'm going to use for this demo coated paper 130 GSM. Doesn't really matter what I'm doing here, but I'm just going to let Imp load that. And in my CSV file, I have the name and the path to a number of components. Each of those components has a PDF document associated with it. So actually I can go look at these things, see a preview, and what you can see is that Imp extracted or detected what the die line is in that particular job. I cannot see any bleed defined here, but that will be taken into account, and when you see the PDF preview of the final imposed sheet, I will show you that we can see the bleed on that end. So each of those has the name of the PDF file. The quantity that we want to print is also read from the CSV file, same as the due date and the paper that is going to be used. And then the inks are determined from the PDF document automatically. So Imp has looked at these files and it has seen that we have a bunch of pure CMYK files, and then we have some files that contain additional spot colors. The dimensions of the files have been extracted, and I also have the bleed for each of these jobs. That's what I entered in the job dialog. Of course, each of these values can now still be modified. So if I don't want 13,000, I could say that I want something else. By default, everything is read from the CSV. Afterwards, you can still go in and manually edit each of these requirements. I don't have anything that is bound in this example. I only have unbound material. And the next step, after I have verified that all of these jobs have been loaded correctly, the next step is to create a plan. And when I create a plan, I get an empty area. On the left-hand side, you get to define which jobs you want to plan. And I can choose that by type of material. I can choose it by group, which means that I can attach metadata to each of these individual files. And then Imp could, for example, plan only the files that belong to a particular client, if I use the name of the client as the metadata that I attach to this job. We're not going to do anything complex here. I'm just going to specify all of them. And you have this little preview because we have a PDF. At any time, I can also go back and look at each of these documents again, of course. And then on the right-hand side, you have the way to create an actual plan. And you can see that there are a lot of options, and for particular workflows, some of these options make a lot of sense. In this particular case, the two that I'm going to use in this demo are plan one layout at a time and plan non-stop. If you're doing production work, this plan non-stop is probably the one you're going to use, because that basically tells Imp that it can use its calculation engine and simply provide me with what it thinks is the most economical option. Now for this demo, I'm going to interfere a little bit, and I'm going to say, well, why don't you calculate options for the first layout, then show me what they are, and then we'll see. So I'm going to select that, and I'm going to select the first two presses in my list. All of the presses from this configuration are in here. I'm going to use all of the sheet sizes that I have available in stock, so those read from the configuration. And I'm going to do irregular nesting. Imp already looked at the jobs that you defined, the jobs that you want to work with. It's determined that those jobs contain die lines, and as such, it suggests to use irregular nesting. I could change that to do rectangular nesting if I wanted to, or if I had to for a particular job, but for here I'm going to leave that, and I'm going to say that the distance between two files should at all times be 3 millimeter. The fact that this changes back to inch when I type it in is because Imp itself is set to inch, and that's because that's how my Windows system, this demo system that I have here, is defined. So Imp simply picks that up from the definition it finds in Windows. Of course, that can be changed. I can use this metadata that I talked about. Maybe I want to print jobs from different clients on different layouts. So I can specify that or use that if I want, and then there is a long list of options that you can set, and some of these options are very important in particular workflows. I'll pick out one. You have options to ensure that the grain of the job is going to be perpendicular to the feeding direction of the press. So that's an option that you can use. You don't have to use it. You set this the way you want. I can also save this as my default settings afterwards, so each time I start planning I end up with the same options. And then in the end, for these two machines that we selected, I can say OK, and because I asked Imp to look at the options for one sheet and then stop, this is what it does. It does the calculations, it shows me one of the options that I have, and then it says next. Why does it say next? Well, what you can see here in the option that I have selected is that 6 of the components have been planned. You can see the same information on the left. 6 of these components have a small blue 1 next to them. That is because they appear on the first sheet. If I select a different option, I'll take this one, I get a different layout, and in this case I only have 5 of these that have been planned in. So each of these could have a different number of components. They can be on different presses. I think all of the ones I have here are on the same press, but probably when I scroll, here is the 6 color press, for example. So each of these options can use a different press. Each of these options can also use a different sheet size. There is a lot of very useful information on here, including the number of sheets that's going to be printed, the wastage that I'm going to have, the number of copies, the quantity for each of these labels that I'm going to print. And the ones that are in red, well, if you look at the numbers, I asked for 13,500 rather, and Imp is suggesting to print 17,800. So there is a bit of an overrun in this one, and that's why it is shown in red. But even though I have an overrun, when you look at the numbers here, Imp has calculated that this is the most economical option. Now, I'm going to move on, say next, and next, and then we're done. So what you can see is that Imp has determined that to print this, I'm going to end up with 3 different layouts, and for each of these layouts I can go and examine in more details. I can, from this layout, export a PDF, and when I zoom in a little bit, you'll see that now Imp also shows me the bleed that I asked for. And it has taken into account the distance, the minimum distance between the cut lines of these different jobs that were placed on the sheet. So I can export the imposed PDF file. I can also export a JDF, either an imposition or a cutting JDF, and I can export a die line, and that die line I get to define what the different names are going to be of the spot colors I have in that output, what the colors are going to be, what the line style is going to be, and so on. So this die line can be exported as a DXF, CF2, PDF, or an HPGL, depending on the cutting machine that you're going to use, or what you need in order to make an actual physical die, for example. So we've calculated all of this, and I'm skipping a lot of details here and a lot of things that are of course also important, but like I said, Imp has a lot of functionality, a lot of features, and I want to show you the highlights of the application. When we go back to our main screen here, we now have this plan, and I have a little summary of that plan and the total cost for this particular job. Of course, at any time I can go back to the plan itself and look in more detail. But what I'm going to do as a very quick conclusion of this demo in Imp is I'm going to calculate a second scenario. So what would happen if, and now I'm going to do plan non-stop because I trust Imp. What happens if instead of the first 2 output devices, I use the second or the third and the fourth output device? Still offset, sheet fed offset, but of course a different device. The rest is the same. I still do all of this. I think I said 3 millimeters bridge gap. So all of that is exactly the same. I'm simply going to modify the output devices here, and I'm going to let Imp calculate. And well, because I've now said do your thing, it is going to do all the calculations by itself. Of course, the more of these output devices that you select while Imp is doing calculations, the more time it's going to take for Imp to do calculations, because the more options it has to go over. But what you can see is that now I am not asked or permitted to make my own pick from these options. Imp has done all of the work automatically. And I get 2 layouts in this case. And what I wanted to show is that now I can go back here and I see these 2 plans in the list, and that would allow me, for example, to compare these 2 plans together and to see that, well, I'm getting a slightly better price in the second case than I get in the first case. Now, you could do this to model what happens with different machines, but you could also, for example, create for a customer an estimate when he outputs the jobs using offset technology, and an estimate for when he outputs the jobs using one of the digital machines that you have, and let them pick between quality on the one hand and costs on the other hand. So Imp is quick enough in the calculations that it does, even though it looks at a lot of different combinations. It is quick enough that you could run it multiple times using different machines, using different technologies, in order to figure out what the best option for a particular customer would be. Okay, so that is the manual version of Imp. And what does it mean when we now say that we can also automate this? Well, it means that I can look at this Imp Flow application and see that in Imp Flow there are multiple hot folder setups. And I'm just going to open one of these setups that has a name. I can specify an input folder. That input folder is where you would put the PDF files or the CSV files or the XML files that contain the jobs that need to be put in Imposition. And then the hot folder allows me to specify an output folder and the actions that are required for this hot folder. And these actions very closely match what we've seen in Imp in the manual version. So for example, it allows me to say, oh, I have PDF documents that I want to put in this hot folder. And then you will remember this from Imp itself, the definition of what are the spot color names for cut lines, crease lines, and so on, inferring or detecting the colors from a PDF document. But if I go to Auto Plan, you'll also recognize the selection of devices that you want to use, the sizes, the algorithm, grouping, and options that we had in Imp itself. So the parameterization that you do here is very, very similar to what you have in Imp. It is not completely identical, and the reason it is not completely identical is that Imp is a manual application, and in some cases that means that you can easily make a decision. In other cases, in this Imp Flow application itself, it means that you're not there to make that decision. So if I go back to my product from PDF, for example, there is an option here that lets you choose what needs to happen if a PDF is dropped that has multiple pages, and it offers you a range of possibilities. For example, I could say, I know that I'm going to have multiple page PDFs, and I know that the front of the work is always going to be page number 1, and the back of the work is going to be page number 2. But I might have a PDF file where I have one page that defines the front, and then I have different back pages depending on the type of work that I have. So this is something that is available in Imp Flow because it is specific to decisions that you have to make in an automated workflow. But you still recognize these things. I can export an Imposition PDF just as I did in Imp. I can export a die line. I can save a report. I did not show you that in Imp itself, but it is possible once the calculations have been done to generate a PDF report. And that PDF report would, amongst many other things, show you how many sheets will be printed, what the total weight is, which jobs will appear on which sheet and how many ups of that job appear on that sheet, paper wastage percentage, costs, and so on and so on and so on. So I can automatically export that report as well. And then this workflow asks to save a product. And a product is that file that I can look at in Imp itself. So if I go back to Imp and I would say save, then that would give me a, so let's call this webinar. That would give me a PDT file, and that's a product file for Imp. If you generate these using the automated workflow in Imp Flow, It means that afterwards I can simply double click on that file. It will open in the manual version of Imp, and because everything is in there, including the calculated plans and so on, I could easily see what calculations Imp Flow has done and whether that is to my satisfaction or not, whether I still want to change something manually or not. So you can even set this up so that you can interfere in the automated workflow at the end if you want. Now, this is not the only capability I have in Imp Flow. I said that it is very easy to integrate this into a larger workflow, and that typically happens through this type of hot folder setup. Again, I would need to define an input folder, but in this input folder, I am saying product from ppxml. ppxml is a normal XML file that defines specific elements and nodes and values that are understood by Imp. And in that XML file, I can define all the components that I want to gang or nest or put in Imposition. Okay? So instead of dropping a PDF document, I drop an XML file, and that XML file could refer to a long list of PDF files that I want to impose together. But look at this check mark here on the right hand side that says run any embedded flow, and what that means is that the XML file that I drop in here can also contain the actual flow. And with flow we mean all of these actions that you want to do. So in that XML file I could specify which devices I want to use. I can specify all the options that I want to use, what type of ganging I want to do, but I can also specify which type of output I want to generate. And the XML file can even say where that output needs to be generated. So I can, in that XML, specify that I want an imposed PDF, all the options for the imposed PDF, and where that imposed PDF has to be generated, including in which folder, what the name is going to be, and so on and so on. So that means that through the use of XML, through the use of this ppxml, Imp Flow actually isn't very smart at all anymore. All of the business logic, all of the control over the larger workflow stays with the MIS software or the workflow software or the website, the web-to-print site where the logic resides. And the only thing that Imp Flow knows is that at some point in a workflow it will get an XML, it needs to read the XML, execute the ganging as described in that XML, and then generate all the output components in a certain location. Yeah? So you can go in one installation of Imp Flow, you can go from cases where you set up the hot folder and you define in Imp Flow what all the actions are that are going to be executed, but you can combine that with integration flows where it is the XML file that comes in that takes all of the decisions. Okay. This is what I wanted to cover during this demo. Let me very quickly summarize. This is an application that can handle all types of bound and unbound products, including rectangular products, die line based products, and so on. It can do mixed ganging or nesting of these products, even though they might be different types of products. You can define what you want to do either manually in Imp, you can define the jobs in CSV, you can define the jobs and what you want to do in XML. It all depends what type of workflow that you have. And you can do the work either manually in Imp or using hot folders, or integrated into a larger flow using hot folders that process these XML files. And of course, as always, it is possible, and we certainly have customers who have done that, it is possible to start with a manual workflow and then over time also implement Imp Flow to automate parts of that manual workflow that can be automated. Thank you very much, and I wish all of you a very pleasant rest of the day. Goodbye.